It's Thursday, July 19, 2018. This is Leyla Vural. I'm in the home of Diane Judge in Manhattan, interviewing her for the Stonewall Oral History Project. Thanks, Diane.
You're welcome.
So oral histories always begin at the beginning of a person's life. Can you tell me where and when you were born and something about how you grew up?
Sure. I was born in West Paterson, New Jersey, which at the time I was born,
88.
88 years, yes, almost 88 years ago, was very much country. I was born in a house that had been built by my grandfather's older brother. They came from Lancashire, England, which was then the silk center of England, and to Paterson, New Jersey, which was then the silk center of the United States, and worked in the silk mills. My grandfather didn't. He was not bright enough to do that. My grandpa, I adored him, but he was a dummy. Anyway, so I was born in a house built by my grandfather and his brother, and I lived there for a year as a baby because my great aunt and great uncle who owned it went off to Europe for a year, and it was the Depression. It was 1931, and my father and mother were still in their teens, and they had no money and no career particularly. So living for a year, watching over my great-grandmother who lived in a little two-room cottage on the property was fine. And I spent a lot of time of my childhood even at that house, which was wonderful. It was right on a canal that went from the coal mines of Pennsylvania down into Newark with barges of coal when it functioned. And then right below it was the Passaic River, just above the Passaic Falls. I don't know if you've ever seen the Passaic Falls?
I do know that area.
Huh?
I do know that area, yes.
Yes, because they've only three on Earth like it, where the water falls into a crevice and goes out sideways, which makes enormous power in the water, which is the banks of the river was lined with silk mills. And that was my origin. And my mother and father were kids in their teens. And I had a year later, my sister was born. And it was very obvious from the moment she was born that she was not a normal person. She was severely mentally crippled. And she lived to be about 22 or 23 years old only, and always stayed very tiny. I called her my itty-bitty sister, and unfortunately the itty stayed and it was reduced to it, which, considering her mental state, was not the nicest. That people would do double takes when they heard the family calling this little baby child it. And it was from Itty, but anyway. No, my grandmother was Dutch from Holland, and the rest of the family, my father's side, were all from the United States for generations. My maternal grandfather was English. And that was it, Paterson, New Jersey, the silk center of the world at the time. And then during World War II, it was they manufactured guns. It became a gun factory everywhere you looked. Yeah, for World War II.
And how do you remember yourself as a child? What were you like?
I was what was called a tomboy. I don't know, have you ever heard that? Yeah, everybody called me a tomboy. I preferred slacks to skirts and dresses. It got to the point where I only wore a skirt on Sunday to go to Sunday school and church. Otherwise, I was always in pants. And I don't know, I preferred to play baseball with the boys and cards and go fishing We lived very close to the Passaic River, so it was only a block away. So from the time I was able to walk down the street by myself, I could go fishing. And I, as I said, a tomboy. And I ended up being called Judge more often than Diane. My first love affair was with a person who had a little child who was about 3 years old. And when I met the child, I said, "Hi, I'm Diane Judge." And she made this growly face and said, "No, I'm Diane." And I said, "Yes, you're Diane Grossman, and I'm Diane Judge." And from then on, she called me Judge. And all of a sudden, everybody I knew called me Judge. And up until one of my later lovers who didn't like the fact that I was called Judge, that's what I was called. So I've had two names all my life. Now, it was Liz Smith when I got with Liz. She refused to call me Judge. I became Diane again.
How old were you when you had your first love affair?
Oh dear. I started off with a guy. I was in high school, and it was right after World War II had just ended. And the guys that had gone off, left school to go to war, were now coming back and going back to high school. And I was sitting in the court luncheonette near Patterson Central High School, and this young man came in and sat down kind of next to me and flirted and what have you. And he and I became, it was my first kind of romance. And everything was going just along fine with Howard Hobson, his name was. My sister would say, "Ho, ho, ho, Howard, he had a very deep masculine voice, and my sister made fun of him all the time. Anyway, but he took me one day, one evening, to New York City. This is from Patterson. It's only 45 minutes by bus away. And anyway, we came to New York City, and we went to Greenwich Village. We were going into this, he wanted to go to this nightclub that was very popular and quite famous. Now I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately. Sugar. For years I knew it. Anyway, we couldn't get in. The maitre d' said, "Come back in 30 minutes, 40 minutes," and they had shows. So we went out on the street, and across the street from this place that we wanted to go to was a bar. So we said, "Okay, we'll go have a drink at the bar until we can." Well, the bar turned out to be a gay bar, which we did not know. And Howard and I are sitting at the bar, and I have to go to the ladies' room. And as I go through the bar, through the back room to the John, I look and I see the jukebox is playing, and I see all these people dancing. And I look a little closer, and I suddenly realized they were all women, right? So I went to the John and went back to Howard, and we went finally across the street. I wish I could remember the name of this saloon. It was a very famous nightclub. Anyway, 2 nights later, I came to the city all by myself and went back to that bar. I'll remember the name and give it to you one day. Isn't that terrible? I knew it for so many years. Anyway, and that's from then on, I went back home and found a girlfriend, and I had quit school at 16, so I had gone back to school. All my friends, well, they weren't my friends. I went to work in a restaurant on the Jersey Shore in Asbury Park, and they were all college students that were waitresses in the restaurant. It was a wonderful restaurant, went right on a pier going out into the ocean. And they convinced me that I had to go back to school, that it was very stupid of me not to finish high school. So I went back to high school at a rather adult age, having seen a lot more than any of the other students around me. And the teachers didn't include me in the class. I sat in the back of the house, and most of the time they would just give me the books and say, you come for the tests. And I didn't have to, and that's how I finally graduated high school.
And was that back in Passaic?
In Patterson.
Or Patterson.
Yeah.
And so, before you went to the gay bar, did you know that you were interested in women? No?
Mm-hmm. I had, as I said, I had been a tomboy. And being a tomboy, I played with nothing but boys. I went fishing. I, played baseball. I mean, all of these things I preferred to do than sit around like with the girls and cook and sew and play with dolls. I had a Shirley Temple doll that I finally sold for a fortune because she was in meticulous condition 50 years later. Not 50, but so no, I think my feeling is that you don't turn that way, you are that way. It's, what would you say, natal?
Yeah, but you didn't know.
No.
So,
I soon found out because my mother, who was only 18 years older than I, after I had had one or two little minor flings, and after each fling, I would move back home. And after like my third trip, that I had little affairs and then back home. And my mother looked at me one day and said, huh, you're just like your father. You can't keep your women either. And I was all of 18 or 19 years old at the time when she said that.
that's good.
Is she heaven? She was wonderful, I must say. Everybody I ever knew adored her.
And were you open with her, or was
Very.
it? Yeah.
From then on, there was no reason not to be.
And did she ever make you feel like that wasn't okay, or?
Nope. No, she didn't. Ironically, I mean, I never thought of it, but I'm sure she would have preferred me to have had children and so on and so on, but she was very happy. She didn't live that long, unfortunately. She had a drinking problem, as my father did also, and she unfortunately fell down a flight of stone steps and cracked her head open while I was living in, I was about 18 or 19, I was living in Europe, in the south of France, in my early 20s, and I got a telephone call, and she had killed her, she hurt herself.
Oh, that's terrible.
Now, alcohol was always was a problem in my family. My father was a bartender, but a terrible drunk also.
And did they stay together when you were growing up?
They were divorced when I was very young. It was about my sister. My sister was mentally very severely, I don't know how to call it. But anyway, he wanted my mother to put her in an institution, and my mother wouldn't have anything to do with that. And there was no reason. Lorraine was not nasty, or, she just had to be taken care of, that's all. She actually was very sweet. My first boyfriend was named Howard Hobson, and he had this big, deep voice and very butch fella. And my sister loved to make fun of him. When he'd leave the house, she'd say, "Ho, ho, 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 my name is Howard, what's yours?" But she would, I don't know that that's funny, just you have to understand what she was like, that she was able to be sarcastic was a sign that there was some intelligence there.
Sure.
Yeah. But anyway.
So tell me about when did you come to New York to live?
Oh heavens, the year. I haven't got a clue what year it would have been.
Were you in your early 20s or?
Yeah, I was in my early 20s, so it was probably around 1951 or so.
And what
I started coming to New York first of all, my mother brought me to the theater. We lived in Patterson, which is only an hour or so by bus away. So my father took me to the zoo. No, my grandfather took me to the zoo. My father would take me to all these beautiful parks and what have you. And my mother came and took me to the theater. I mean, I remember I was a little kid, and I remember going to the theater. Somewhere I have all of the playbills of all the plays I saw back in the 30s and 40s, what have you. So New York was always very much a part of my life. So moving here was easy.
What were you and your mom living on during the Depression?
My mother was a waitress, and my father was a chef. I grew up in the restaurant business, and by the time I was 13, I was working in the restaurant where my mother was a waitress, in the kitchen, handing out hot coffees and iced coffee and iced teas, and on the weekends when I didn't go to school, on Friday night, Saturday, and the restaurant wasn't open on Sunday. So, but anyway, that's how I started it, and for years I worked in restaurants, and later in life became a hat check girl, and made a lot of money. Because I worked in bars where I kept the money. Most hat check people, the money gets dropped into a slot in a box in the door, and the owners split it, not evenly or honestly with the person. But I always worked in a wonderful gay bar in the village called Lenny's Hideaway, right off 6th Avenue. And it was not owned by the mafia. It was one of the few bars in the city that was not owned. Most gay bars are owned by the mafia. Well, I don't know about today, because I haven't been to a gay bar in years. But then, anyway, they were all mafia owned. And Lenny's Hideaway was just off 6th Avenue, around 8th Street. And Lenny was a sweetheart. And he gave me a job as the hat check girl, and he let me keep all my money. So I made a lot of money. Hat checks, if the place is busy, especially like a gay bar, because the guys, for example, would come in, check their coats, cruise around the bar for an hour, half an hour, take their coat, go to the next bar. I mean, they would make 2 and 3 trips a night back to the same bar, and each time I got a tip for checking their coat. So I made and saved the money and went to Fire Island.
So when roughly were you at Lenny's bar?
What, honey?
When roughly were you working at Lenny's? Like, how old were you when you were there?
In my early 20s.
So
I was legally, actually, when I first went to work at Lenny's, I was legally, you're supposed to be 21 in the city, I think, to work in a place that sells liquor. I'm not sure. But anyway, I was in my early 20s at that point.
And was it a bar that women and men came
It was mostly guys, but a lot of women. I mean, it was one of the rare bars that both types came in. And it was, and Lenny himself, as I said, it was not involved with the mafia, and he was a very sweet, sweet man. And it was called Lenny's Hideaway. And
And do you remember how you got there? Like how you got the job?
I went in one day as a customer, and it wasn't very crowded, and Lenny was there, and I heard him talking to somebody on the telephone, saying that he needed somebody in the hot check room. So I didn't do anything that night. I came back like the next night. I had been thinking about it, and I thought, why not? I'd try. So is Lenny around? Yes, he's right there. I went over to Lenny and said hi and introduced myself and said, I understand you need a hat check girl. And I grew up in the restaurant business, which I did because of my mother and father. And I would love to. And I love your bar, and I love that he gave me the job. And as I said, he didn't take, usually there was a box in the door with a slot, and your tips went into the box, and at the end of the night, you got some of it. You were lucky to get half. But he never, it was all mine.
And was it a bar was it a dancing bar?
No, not quite. It wasn't that big.
How long did you work there? How long were you working there?
Oh, I went not maybe from say fall until spring, the following spring. That would be it, because it came spring. I wasn't needed because nobody checked a coat in the warm weather. So I had saved all my money. And I went to Fire Island, to Cherry Grove. Friends invited me. They were renting a house, and I fell in love with Fire Island. You have to understand, this is back in the 50s, and Fire Island was a lot different than it is today. Have you ever been?
I don't know it very well.
No. Well, I mean, back then, I can't now remember, Cherry Grove was the second largest city. And the place that's now the second largest city, whose name I've forgotten, up the thing had only 3 little houses. And one of those houses was rented by Truman Capote. And I was out there all summer by myself in a house shared with 4 or 5 gals. But they only came out on weekends. And I was there all week, all by, and alone. And I went to work in the grocery store, just out of boredom more than anything else, because the island did not have electricity, so you couldn't have a television or, your entertainment was to go to the bar and dance, put a quarter in the jukebox, and get 6 plays for a quarter, and da 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 da. And it had a theater, and I joined the theater and appeared in three plays over the course of the summer. I actually stood up on the stage and sang, oh gosh, I can't remember what the song was, but it was a knockout. There was a guy who owned a saloon on the mainland, came to me and asked me if I'd like to go to work for him and sing in his nightclub. And I thought, what? And I went, but the moment I got there, and the guy who was playing the piano was very doubtful about my talent, et cetera, as well he should have been. And I never even sang that night. I said to the guy, I'm sorry, I can't do this.
You were too nervous.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did you meet Truman Capote?
Hmm. Oh, yeah. Constantly.
What was that like?
Nothing special. He wasn't, he was very sweet and dear, but
And were you living openly at that time? Did you feel like you had to hide that you were lesbian, or?
I didn't have, I didn't have to, because I was not working in an ambiance where I had to hide anything. I was working in a gay bar as a hat check girl, so, and I made, because Lenny let me keep all my money, I made enough so that all summer I didn't have to work. And that summer on Fire Island, by the middle of the summer, I met a woman who changed my life. And her name was Betty Lee Hunt, and she was a Broadway press agent, and we became lovers. And I moved into her house and what have you, and she made me an apprentice in the press agents union because she was the queen of off-Broadway at the time. Off-Broadway was just beginning. We're in the late 50s now. And off-Broadway was just beginning to happen. And for some reason, Betty Lee got one off-Broadway show after another. And so she made me an apprentice. And within 2 or 3 years, I became a member of the Press Agents Union. And the two of us could handle 3 shows together, and up to 3, maybe even more. Now I'm not quite certain. But anyway, that's how I broke into the theater and into the publicity business with Betty Lee.
And when you were doing that work, how openly could you live?
Well, the theater is an interesting business to be in because you can be openly gay in the theater. People don't seem to, I'm not saying that everybody in the theater wouldn't give you a hard time for being gay, but most of the people, it doesn't matter.
Even in those days?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And where did you live?
Well, to begin with, I had a furnished room in the Village on Greenwich Street, and it was a furnished room. And then I took an apartment, oh dear, on I've forgotten the street. It was near Hudson. It was a very lovely apartment. It really was, in a very nice building. And it was rent controlled, so it wasn't expensive. And that's...
And did you stay working with Betty for a long time?
Well, Betty Lee and I became more than...
Right.
And I lived with her for, as I said, she changed my whole life.
Yeah.
Mainly because of the work. It gave me a career which I never would have had, other than waiting on tables.
And was that your career for the rest of your working life?
Yeah, yes.
And
I was Michael Bennett's press agent. Michael? I was Michael Bennett's press agent till the day he died, and I did a lot of nice Broadway stuff.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. And did you know from those early days when you were on Fire Island that you loved the theater?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As I said, my mom started me
Yeah.
as a little kid. She would take me every Christmas, not just to Radio City for the music hall, but to the theater. Anything she thought a kid could watch. And and it worked. I was hooked.
And you were were young when you didn't have a mom anymore or your sister, did you have family that you were connected to as an adult?
Not really.
What was that like for you?
It didn't really matter because my mother was, mother and her mother and my grandmother were family. My father's side of I never got close with, and he married again. And I have a half brother and a half sister, and I have no idea who or where or where they are. I saw them when they were little tiny tots, and I was still in my teens. But I've never heard from the little boy once. I call him a little boy. He's a grown fellow now, Bruce Judge. About 2 years ago, I got a couple of phone calls, messages. He was obviously trying to find me and make a connection, but I didn't want to.
Did you used to go to, when you were in the theater business, did you go to gay bars?
Sure.
What bars did you like?
Oh, well, oh gosh, I can't remember them. Isn't that terrible?
That's okay. Can you tell me what did...
I mean, I can remember Lenny's because it changed my life. But later, well, Betty Lee she wouldn't really go, she didn't care for the bars that much, so we really did stop going. But I haven't, sorry.
That's okay, no worries. And were you involved at all in the 50s in any kind of lesbian groups or sort of the early gay rights?
Nothing existed.
Yeah.
I don't remember there being any kind of organizations.
Did you know about the Daughters of Bilitis?
The Daughters of...
Bilitis?
No.
You didn't know about them? Okay.
Nope.
Okay. And can you tell me a little bit more what your life was like in the 50s and in the 60s?
Well, as I said, I'm trying to remember how I met. Oh, yes, because I was an opera creep. And the moment I found out that I could stand at the old Met, I went to work one summer. I was 16 or 17 years old. 16, I think. I was madly in love with a woman, a married woman and mother, who worked with my mother in a restaurant. I had no idea what it was happening to me, but I just followed her around like a puppy. And she went off one summer to work in Asbury Park as a waitress. And I went along following her. And I was too young. I wasn't even 16. I don't think I was 16 yet. I was too young to work in a restaurant that served liquor. So where she worked in Asbury Park, I had to go to the city next door to Asbury called Ocean Grove. Do you know it?
I do.
It's a religious, I don't know what it is today, but then it was a very strong religious community, and no alcohol, nothing. I mean, nothing was open on Sunday. You couldn't move your car on Sunday. If you parked there Saturday night, that stayed there until Monday morning, because you were not allowed to move it on Sunday. The law was. Anyway, this gal Lillian Brown, whom I had this big crush on, she worked with my mother. She was a mother and had a little girl whom she sent off to some school. She was very Southern and very flirty. She flirted with everybody, men, women, and children, obviously. And I couldn't work, and as I said, it was illegal for me to work in a bar with liquor, where liquor was sold. So I got to work in Ocean Grove, which was a religious community down. Do you know it?
I have been there, yes.
Yeah, anyway, it was a very, I don't know about today, but then it was a very strong religious community. And nothing was open on Sunday, let alone you could work. And I got a job in a restaurant, and all the girls, as a bus girl, I was too young to even be a waitress, even though it didn't serve liquor. I was too young to be on a payroll, frankly, and the guy just took pity on me and gave me a job as the bus girl. But all the waitresses, they were all college students, and they just took me under their wings, especially 2 or 3 of them, and insisted that by fall I had to go back to school and finish high school and go on to school and so on and so on. And they changed my life, thank God. You know, I went back to high school, Patterson Central, and because I was older, I was always seated in the back of the class. It got to the point where I didn't even go to the class. They gave me the books and the tests, and I arrived for the tests and what have you, but I didn't have to sit in the class. I sat in the court luncheonette and drank coffee and what have you, and studied my book and what have you. And anyway, that's how I graduated high school at long last. There was a reason I was telling that, was about meetings. I met a gal named Grace Sosha, who I got a crush on. And I had never thought of, this had never happened to me. But I was really, and she lived in East Orange, and I spent all my time, extra time, going back and forth from Patterson to East Orange on buses, and so on, to be with her. I just was madly in love with this girl. And her father, they were strong Italians, called me boy girl, because he understood what was going on in my mind. I didn't, but he did. And he'd, boy girl, what have you. I don't know. One night, Gracie and I went to sleep, and I made a pass at her. And I had no idea what sex was. When I say I made a pass, I had no idea what I was doing, but I wanted to neck and, kiss and hug and love. And she threw me not only out of the bedroom, but she threw me out of her life. And her daddy's boy girl, she would have nothing more to do with me. And it broke my heart, because I just adored her and what have you. However, it moved me onto another level of life where I experimented a little,
Was that before you'd been to the village with Howard? Remember you said you came?
Yeah.
Do you know if that was before that or after that?
I was after.
And did you have a name? Did you think to yourself, did you have vocabulary to describe what you were feeling?
Not really.
And do you remember if you were comfortable with it, or if you thought?
Well, as I said, it was that this relationship I had with Gracie didn't go anyplace, obviously, and I never pursued. It didn't set me off pursuing. I just went back home, where I was still living anyway. But my mother felt sorry for me. She knew that I had lost a nice friend and what have you. And for my birthday that August, she gave me a car, a used Chevy convertible, what have you. And that did change my life, because I could now wander wherever I wanted to, And I wandered to New York City a lot. And as I said, I wandered into Lenny's Hideaway one. Actually, Howard Hobson, this guy I was having an affair with, he had been in the service and had now come back to high school. He was about 4 years older than I, so he must have been 21 or I was 17. And he and I went, he took me to the Village, to New York, to the Village, and we were to go, I wish I could remember it was a very popular nightclub in the Village, not gay, but a very popular nightclub, right off 6th Avenue on something like 4th Street. Sugar. I can't remember the name. Anyway, we couldn't get in because they were so busy. And the maitre d' said, come back at such and such a time and I'll put your name down and you see the show at that time. So that's what he did. And we went across the street. There was a bar and we went and sat at the bar to have a few drinks while we waited to get into whatever this nightclub was called. And I had to go to the Johns. And as I passed through the bar and passed through the back room on the way to the ladies' room, there was a jukebox playing and a lot of people dancing. And as I looked in, and then I did this double take because all the people dancing were all women. And I went, duh. And anyway, went back with Howard, spent the evening, went home. The next night, got on a bus and came back to the bar in the Village and changed my life.
And you still didn't have a name or a word, or did you start to have vocabulary to how you thought about yourself and what was going on?
I can't think of anything at the time. Eventually, when I got involved with gay people, yes, we were gay. Unfortunately, ladies were very often called dykes, which I didn't find very pleasant. And it was usually bags who called us dykes. Anyway, but the vocabulary eventually just came on one naturally. You picked it up, but offhand, right this minute, I can't.
Okay. Do you remember when Stonewall happened?
I was working as a waitress down in the Village, and I remember very well because wasn't Stonewall where was Stonewall?
Stonewall is on Christopher Street,
Yeah.
right off of Sheridan Square.
Right, and the restaurant, Joe's Luncheonette, was on 4th Street between the square and 6th Avenue.
And that's where you were working? Had you ever been to the Stonewall? Do you remember going there?
Not really. I think I went in once. It was mainly boys, right?
I think it was a mix. Also,
Well,
but probably mostly men. Also, trans people.
bars were very separated. Yeah. It was very rare. Not very rare. I never knew a bar that had boys and girls at that time.
Yeah. I was not there. I heard it was some mix, and definitely also trans people.
I mean, I vaguely remember going once, and it was they were rude, and because I was alone, they didn't want me. It was interesting. They would take a single guy, but they didn't want a single girl.
So it's interesting that you say that. I watched an interview with Alma Rootsong. She wrote the book Patience and Sarah. Did you know the novel Patience and Sarah?
No.
It's a
What's it?
It's called Patience and Sarah.
Yeah.
It's a lesbian love story. It was published in the late 60s. It's a beautiful book. And the writer wrote under a pseudonym. She called herself Isabel Miller, but her real name was Alma Rootsong. And I watched an interview that's recorded of her, and she talked about how in the late 60s, lesbians really needed to be in a pair, that if they were single, like you were saying, but even in like the social scene, she described that when she was single, she was not welcome, even with other lesbians. But if she was in a part of a couple, things were. Did you ever experience that?
I don't feel that I did, no. I mean, going single into a bar was something else.
Right, but in your social life.
But my social life, no, I don't. I was very lucky socially because Betty Lee Hunt made all the difference in the world because she worked in the theater.
And she really opened a world to you.
And not only did she give me work, which I just retired from recently, but there was no conflicts of any sort.
And did you stay with her as a romantic partner for a long time?
Yeah, well, isn't that funny? I haven't thought about this in so long. We were together as lovers at least 6 years or so, and then we stayed because we had a house out in Long Island. We were the earliest couples, one of the earliest couples to buy a house in the Hamptons, in Bridgehampton, on Lumber Lane, and I went to work. There were gay bars, and I went to work over the summer in the gay bars out there, which Betty Lee did not make her happy at all. But she made me a member of the Press Agents Union, which I'm still a member of, and that changed my life, frankly. Yeah. I mean, as I said, I was Michael Bennett's press agent till the day he died, and so many theater people.
That's how you know so many people. And so why were you working at a bar in the summer? Was it partly just because you liked it?
I had no career. I had nothing.
But when you bought a house with Betty Lee on Long Island.
Yeah, well, she didn't want me working at a bar. She put me to work in her office and signed me up in the union as a press agent, and I eventually became a member of the union, which I still am, and a press agent, a Broadway press agent. She was the queen of off-Broadway, which was just beginning to happen in the early 50s. And she handled 3 and 4 off-Broadway shows, you know.
And so once you were involved with her, that was the end of working in bars?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did you enjoy it, though?
Oh, sure. I loved being a press agent. It was fun. I loved the theater. I had always, bless my mother, you know, she had always 2 or 3 times a year brought me to New York City to go to the theater.
After Stonewall happened, do you remember if you thought that was an important event?
What was?
Stonewall, when the uprising happened. And do you remember if that felt important to you?
I didn't think it. I just thought it was a scandal. It didn't dawn on me that it was going to become historical.
Okay. Do you remember the next year there was the first, what we now think of as the Pride March? The very first one was in June of 1970 to commemorate.
You mean the parade?
Yes.
I walked in it.
The first one in 1970. Can you tell me about that?
I don't ask me why. I was living down on 38th Street. Liz Smith and I had a wonderful apartment on 38th and between Madison and Park in a brownstone building. It was fabulous, with a fireplace in the living room, a beautiful, beautiful apartment, and what have you. And I remember going out and walking to Fifth Avenue because there was all these people. There were all these people on the streets and what have you, and there was this parade. And I don't know, I kind of joined it, and because it was almost at the end of their 38, they were going down to the village, and I literally got in line and walked with them. And what was your question?
I was asking if you remembered the first march in
Yeah, well,
1970.
that was it.
That was it. And do you remember how that felt? What did it feel like to join?
Oh, I got very excited. I really thought that something wonderful was happening. Because up until then, I don't think gay people thought anything could ever help them or change, their being abused by society in general. And I really think that changed everybody's life in a way.
How did you meet Liz Smith?
I was a hat check girl and hostess in a gay bar on Bleecker Street in the 50s. And one night around 5:30, 6 o'clock, I came to work. I had just come to work. I was still kind of taking off my regular clothes and hadn't put my apron back on because I not only was the hat check girl, but earlier in the evening I worked I did the bar too because the bartender didn't come in till like 6:30 or so. And anyway, I'm doing fussing and doing, it was mostly what I did behind the bar. There were no customers. I would make sure fill all the ice bins and fill all the pickles and the lemons and cherries and so on, and get the bar prepared for the evening ahead of time. At one point I looked up and two gals had come in, and they went to the bar and sat down. And I went and said yes, and they ordered 2 Bloody Marys, and I kept looking at the one, and I said to her, "Kay Ballard?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, I just saw you on Broadway a couple of weeks ago. You were so wonderful." She had you know who Kay Ballard is?
I didn't know her, no.
No? Anyway, Kay Ballard is a wonderful, wonderful performer, and she had just done this one-woman show on Broadway, which I had seen. And I just started to rave at her, right, from my side of the bar. And she says, "What's your name?" And I said, "Diane Judge." I said, "But I'm basically called Judge." "Okay, Judge, this is my friend Liz Smith." And that was the first time I met Liz Smith. And at 15, 20 minutes later, I said to Kay, "Are you still working?" Because I had seen her only a few weeks. She had a one-woman show on Broadway. And she said, "Yes." I said, "Well," and she said, "Oh, my God, thank you." And she said, "Lizzie, I can't take you home. I've got to run." And she started pulling out money, and I said, No, that's on me. Thank you. You do it. Anyway, Kay flew off to go to work, and I was left with Miss Smith, who...
And was she already Liz Smith then? I mean, was she known?
No, she wasn't. Oh no, she was. I'm trying to remember. I think she was still working with Oleg Cassini and writing a society column in the Journal American. The city had 7 newspapers at the time, and what did I just say his name was?
Oleg Cassini.
Oleg Cassini, but I'm trying to remember. The column wasn't called Cassini. It wasn't Walter Winchell. It was. They used a name that was somebody once previous, very famous. Now I can't remember what it was. But anyway, it was a society gossip column in the Journal American. And she was Cassini's, that was her first job as a columnist. She had gone in school to study journalism, but this was the first time she was actually working, gossiping.
And did you get involved with her right then, or was?
No, not that night. I put her in a cab, and she said no. I mean, I offered to, and she said no, she could walk home. She was only a few blocks away. And the season came to an end, and I had saved my money, and I went out to Fire Island for the summer and shared a house with a bunch of girls. And I was the only one who was there all week, 7 days. They came out on the weekends. And I'm in the kitchen one day, opening there was no electricity on Fire Island at that point. You had a thing on the roof that sun created, heated the water, what have you, and you got a certain amount of electricity from I can't remember what it was called. It was a box that made electricity out of the sun, but as I said, very little. But the refrigerator was an ice box, and you put a big hunk of ice in it. And I was in the kitchen, and we had a side boardwalk, as well as the boardwalk in the front of the house. We had one that ran along the side of the house. And I'm there in the refrigerator, puddling with the ice, and I look, and somebody's just walked by. And I thought, they're going to my John, because that's what was at the end of the boardwalk, was the toilet, not the bathroom. There was no such thing as it. We had a shower. Anyway, I opened the door and looked, and this gal came back, and I said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "They told me to go down the boardwalk to the end of the last house on the boardwalk and turn right." And I said, "I think you mean the last boardwalk." So anyway, I walked this lady back to where you get off the boat and onto the main boardwalk, and said, "Now you go right straight down there to the end of this boardwalk, and then turn right and go to the end of that boardwalk." And it was Liz Smith. I didn't know it. She didn't name herself, and I didn't ask. And later that evening, I went to that house for cocktails, and there she was, and that's how we met.
So that was after you were with Betty Lee.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no.
No?
No, I met Betty Lee that summer.
That same summer. So you met both of them that summer.
Yeah.
I see. Wow.
And I hooked up with Betty Lee for 5 or 6 years. And Lizzie she lived with Shirley Hers and a girl named Selma Lynch. And Selma died. But
so you knew them both, you met both of them in the 50s. And when did you get involved with Liz Smith?
Well, as I said, we were very close friends, and she was living with a gal, Gloria Sapphire, who was a theater agent, and they had broken up, but they still lived together. And Liz was working with Charlie Knickerbocker, the column, Igor Cassini, on the column Charlie Knickerbocker, and she was invited to the opera one night, and she wasn't particularly fond of opera, but Cassini wanted this one covered, so he insisted. He couldn't go. He insisted she go. She knew I was a big opera buff, and so she took me to the opera. I had known her just casually in a social group. She and Betty Lee Hunt, who had become my lover at the time, they were old friends. Anyway, Betty Lee at one point said to me, "Diane, you have a car, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "I wonder, are you doing anything on Saturday?" And I said, "No, why?" She said, "Well, a very close friend of mine is moving from 94th Street down to the Village, and I sure would appreciate it if you could drive us in your car." She's not moving furniture, she's just moving personal stuff. And I really had no choice because Betty Lee was my boss, and I had to say yes, more or less. So I arrived, picked Betty Lee up, and we went to something like 94th Street on the east side, and there was Liz Smith and a little woman named Selma Lynch, and Shirley Hers. Well, Shirley wasn't living there, but anyway, Selma and Lizzie were there, and the street was loaded with all this stuff, and I spent the whole day driving Liz Smith's and Selma Lynch's personal articles, et cetera, to her house, to the new apartment down on the Lower Village, and what have you. And they asked me to stay. They took me to dinner, and that was kind of the first time I really ever saw her. And I remembered her from the first time seeing her when she tried to get into my kitchen door, thinking she didn't remember that ever.
Was she open? Did people know that she was lesbian and involved with women? I don't remember that about her.
I don't think so. She wasn't, I wouldn't say she was closeted particularly, but she was very, I don't know, socially she didn't go to bars. I mean, her life as a gay woman was so totally different from mine. I mean, I think everybody knew I was gay, and you know.
So what was it like to be involved with her then? Was that difficult?
I mean, when we first got together?
Yeah, and even at
No.
all.
We had, first of all, there's a society, you know. We didn't have to step out of it. She was Charlie Knickerbocker, where she was accepted every place, and I was working for, at one point, Michael Bennett. And so, I mean, there was no way to be hurt socially.
And did you go to a lot of things together? Did you go to events together?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Everybody, I think, I can't imagine anyone not knowing that we weren't.
And how long were you together?
Quite a few. We lived together something like 14 years or so. But at the end, we were just friends, exes, until she got involved. When she got her own column, see, she had been Charlie Knickerbocker working with Igor Cassini. Or was it, yeah, Igor's the writer and Oleg's the designer.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, anyway, the one that was the writer, she worked with him, and there was no reason. I mean, you know, we didn't do anything that was remarkable or could hurt. You can work in the theater and be gay.
Right.
So I had no problems, you know, that way. And she was very social and very, Lizzie was never, I went through a period in my life when I was butch. And she always was very feminine. So nobody ever guessed by looking at her that she was a lesbian. So she never had any problems. I don't remember socially being gay.
So tell me about being butch. When was that?
Huh?
Tell me about when you were butch. When was that?
Well, I don't know. I think I still am I? No? No? Oh, I don't know. I think when I first thought of myself as being gay, I don't know. Maybe it's a different time. Maybe today gals wear trousers more than, it doesn't mean anything today any longer because you can live in them. Where back 30, 40 years ago, to wear slacks all the time made people a little curious as to why.
So that by itself was already a statement.
Well, it's interesting. I've never thought of that, but think about that. I was never butch in the sense of you know, being. If I used the word, I didn't mean it to mean that I was butch. Funny.
So do you remember sort of how life was changing in the 70s? Like because you were in the theater, so you were saying you never felt like you had to be careful or hide, but do you remember kind of the larger culture and things starting to feel more open? Do you remember kind of the sort of how sort of the larger culture was evolving and starting to feel more open, like people could be lesbian and gay in any setting?
It just evolved, didn't it?
Yeah. Do you remember sort of noticing that it was changing?
Not really, probably because I was part of the movement. It was happening to me as well as everybody else that I knew. I don't know. Maybe we also, there's a very strong possibility that it was a difference also between where I lived, who I knew, how I lived, and today. As I elevated myself in life, work-wise and career-wise, I mean, and in every other way, things changed. I probably became less butch, in quote-unquote butch, in looks, in dress, in attitude. I don't know. And today I don't know anybody. I'm sure they're still down there in those saloons in the village. I occasionally see them. It was just, about a month or so ago, I can't remember. I was with friends and we walked by someplace and fell over laughing because as we looked in the people going into the place, the gals were, I mean, butch is not the word. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I changed and eased up out of it. Maybe I was that butch to begin with.
But do you remember, kind of as society felt freer, that it wasn't only in the theater, that it was okay to just be who you are and live how you want to live?
Today.
Yeah, over time.
It was not all the time back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember being victimized very often by men with whom I worked and what have you. If they didn't pick on me, I heard them picking on other women and saying really nasty, horrible things about women they thought were lesbians.
Even when you were working you were in the theater world?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's a little easier than some of the real world, I mean the rest of the world, but it still has its moments of, you know, no, there are so many producers who are very anti-gay.
And how did you handle that?
Hmm?
How did you handle that?
I didn't have to, fortunately.
How so? Because
I was always hired, I mean, I always worked for people who were good about it, you know. And then, but the last years I actively worked was with Michael Bennett, and he too was gay, so, you know.
And did you go to Pride marches after that first one that you joined? Was going to the Pride march? And
No.
No.
No, I've never really joined any kind of organization.
Just not what interested you?
As I said, I don't know that Memorial Day that I walked in the parade. It wasn't Memorial Day, it was the gay
It was
parade.
the Pride, yeah.
Huh?
The Pride march.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why or how I got there, but I mean, I don't regret it.
But it wasn't what you usually did.
Hmm?
It didn't become a regular thing for you. Want to tell me about Peggy?
What?
Want to tell me about Peggy?
What about Peggy?
How did you meet Peggy?
A friend named Shirley Scully, do you know?
I don't know, Shirley.
Anyway, Shirley Scully is a very, very old friend. She's cranky and hard to get along with at this point in our lives, so I don't really see her any longer. But she called me up one day, and how many years ago, I can't remember, but anyway, and said, Diane, would you like to join me for dinner on Thursday night, because I'm having dinner with a gal I think you'll enjoy meeting. And that was it. And Peggy and I enjoyed meeting and made a personal date. She worked in the theater. She was a agent. So we had a lot in common. And she was a sweet person, dear.
And you lived here together?
Yes, this was her apartment to begin with. And most of the old Southern furniture is all hers. She came from a rather well-off Southern family. The books are mine.
Tell me about your books. How do you have how is it that you have so many books?
Well, I worked with Liz Smith. They came in for nothing. And also, I love to read. I always have. And most of them they're not novels. They're mostly nonfiction.
It's tremendous.
I don't, at this point, I don't get new ones any longer.
So I want to ask you, as we were talking about, in June it'll be 50 years since the Stonewall
Really?
uprising. Yeah.
Wow.
So, what do you think about that? Like when you think about what life was like then and how things have changed for the lesbian and gay community.
Unfortunately, I don't have any feelings about it because my life hasn't changed. I've lived openly gay all my life, and I'm trying to remember if I ever really suffered from being open about it. I don't think so. I was lucky that I could work in an industry where being gay was not a problem, the theater.
And sort of for the larger community, that wasn't something you were ever really part of, sounds like. Yeah.
Nope. I started out in the restaurant business, but from the moment I met Betty Lee, I never worked in anything else but the theater. She made me a Broadway press agent, a member of the union, which I'm still a member of, and every now and then I don't even have to go to work. They put my name on a contract.
What union is that?
The Press Agents Union.
Press Agents Union.
Press Agent and Managers, ATPAM it's called. The American Theatrical Managers and Press Agents.
That's great. Do you still go to the theater?
Oh, sure. I just saw Mean Girls a couple of weeks ago.
How was it?
It's wonderful.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, I still get invited.
Is there anything you want to tell me about that I haven't asked you about, sort of what your life has been like in New York and sort of what it's been to live openly and
How what?
Is there anything else you want to tell me about what it's been like to live in New York and live openly?
Oh, I don't find that. It's interesting because I never think about being gay. Hey, here I'm talking about like the doormen or people that well, first of all, working in the theater, you don't have to worry about being gay, really. That's a big, it would make things a lot different in some other business. But I haven't, in my entire life, and what am I, going to be 88 in a week or so? I don't think I've really had too many problems about being gay. And I certainly am not feminine. Do you know what I mean? I haven't worn a skirt, and I don't even know if I own a skirt. Probably somewhere. Funny. I've never tried to hide it. And I've never, knock around wood, I've never really had problems.
That's lucky.
But even most of the people I know have rarely, seriously. From Liz Smith, who way up there on the top of the social heap, everybody knew she was gay, and yet nothing serious ever happened to her. because she was gay. I'm not saying every now and then she didn't get a little slap in the face for it, but basically nothing serious. I never knew anything bad happened to Peggy or most of my friends.
Good.
Mm-hmm. No, not lucky. I think that's the way it is. Don't you?
Well, I have a lot of people.
I don't know. Maybe we look and dress and, or you know, we're not terribly butch, or behave in a way that's obnoxious. But I don't know anybody who's had a major problem about being gay, especially the women. If anybody, some of the real swishy boys that I've known can have problems.
Yeah. Some people have described feeling like they had to live, in secret, and really had to kind of protect themselves.
They have what?
That they had to live closeted, and really had to think about how they lived and who knew what about them. A lot of people. Yeah, a lot of people.
Well, it's very easy for me to say that's not possible. But again, I work in the theater. It makes a big difference what you do in life, how you're going to be treated. I imagine being butch and working in, an office somewhere with a lot of straight people might change the one's opinion that would have. In the theater, I think you're lucky. One is lucky.
Should we say goodbye? Should we turn this off?
Hmm?
Should we turn off the recorder?
Sure.